I was changing the locks on a house I had just purchased when 3 SUVs pulled up to the curb. The woman who stepped out first didn't ask my name. She looked at my oil-stained hands, my work shirt, the color of my skin, and said it right there in front of 2 county sheriff's deputies. "You're a black man, not the owner." Then she demanded they escort me off my own property. I didn't argue. I picked up my phone, pulled up an email, and said, "You might want to check the records first." 10 minutes later, she wasn't asking to have me removed. She was asking whether we could settle this quietly, just between neighbors. If you like stories where arrogance digs its own grave, hit subscribe and stay, because what Marla missed is going to cost her everything. 3 months before that morning, I bought a house at the end of Ashford Lane, in a planned neighborhood called Cedar Hollow Estates. I wasn't looking for the most impressive address in the area, and I wasn't trying to announce myself. I had been searching for something with real land, not a quarter-acre postage stamp with a fence and a view of someone else's fence. And what I found at the end of that lane checked every box I had. More than 6 acres total, a private driveway that curved back a good distance from the road, a storage outbuilding with solid framing under years of neglect, and an eastern boundary line that ran along the edge of a man-made pond the neighborhood maintained for recreation and irrigation. The house itself was modest to the lot size. Dated kitchen, old siding, a roof that had maybe 2 seasons left before it needed replacing, and none of that was a problem. I'd spent 15 years running a small construction company before selling my stake. I knew exactly what deferred maintenance looked like, and I knew how to fix every bit of it with my own hands. The seller was Grant Holloway, 61 years old and done with cold winters. He had owned the property for decades and was moving to Arizona to be near family. He wasn't looking to squeeze the market. He wanted a fast, clean closing and a buyer who wouldn't back out at the last minute. Through the law office of Lydia Palmer, a real estate attorney I had worked with on several transactions over the years, we put together a straightforward deal. Cash purchase, title cleared, deed recorded at the county courthouse within the week. Lydia was the kind of attorney who read every exhibit and every attachment before she let a deal close, and when she handed me the final binder, I knew the paperwork was airtight. There was one document in that binder, labeled Exhibit C, that I had skimmed and set aside, telling myself I'd read it properly when I had more time. That would turn out to be the most important piece of paper in the entire file. I moved in on a Tuesday, and I moved in the way I've always done things, quietly. A pickup truck, a few boxes, my tools in the back. No convoy, no hired crew, no occasion made of it. Cedar Hollow was pristine that morning, shaped hedges, clean driveways, front gardens that someone was clearly being paid to keep sculpted. I had no particular interest in the neighborhood's social ecosystem. I had spent enough of my life in spaces where people looked at me and decided, before I had said a word, that I didn't belong. I had learned something over the years. The most effective response to that assumption is no response at all. Keep working, let the paperwork speak. I had 6 acres and a storage building that needed a new door frame, and that was where I put my attention. She appeared before noon. A silver sedan slowed at the foot of my driveway, paused, then reversed, and came back up toward where I was working. The woman who stepped out was dressed the way people dress when they consider themselves the standard against which a neighborhood measures everything else. Pressed slacks, a blazer, hair done. She introduced herself as Marla Whitcomb, president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. She looked at my truck, at the open toolboxes, at me, and then she asked, "Are you working for the new owner?" I told her I was the new owner. She smiled like I had made a small error she was too polite to correct, then looked me over slowly from boots to face before she said, "I mean the owner of record." I said that would be me. She didn't apologize. She asked which company I worked for. I told her the owner of record was Darius Cole, that was my name's, and I was standing directly in front of her. She asked if the property was held through a trust or a corporate entity. I said no. She smiled once more, said she hoped I'd get comfortable soon, and drove off. She checked her rear view once before she turned out of the lane. 2 days later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. I expected a welcome packet, maybe a community directory, some information about HOA fees and meeting schedule. What I pulled out instead had a line stamped in large block letters across the top of the first page, Nord of Unauthorized. The deed for that property had been recorded at the county courthouse. My name was on it. My parcel number was listed in the county assessor's database. There was nothing secret or ambiguous about who owned the house at the end of Ashford Lane. I set the letter on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment, and then I understood that what was happening here was not about paperwork. I read the HOA letter twice from beginning to end before I responded. According to Marla's notice, the association had no record of a new owner registering with the organization, no vehicle information on file, and no prior approval of the current occupants, meaning me. They were therefore characterizing my presence as unauthorized pending a review. I sent a short, carefully worded email to the HOA's listed address. I am the owner of record for this property. If the association requires specific documentation beyond what is already on file with the county, please indicate which provision of the governing documents requires it. I kept a copy of every message I sent, dated and time-stamped from that point forward. Marla did not answer the question. Instead, she appeared at my front door 2 days later, this time accompanied by a woman named Denise Calder, who I would later learn was the HOA secretary. Marla's tone was measured, almost pleasant, but the pleasantness had a quality to it. the kind you feel when someone is being cordial as a tactic rather than as a reflex. She said the association always made a point of welcoming new residents personally, that they liked to know who was living in the neighborhood. I told her she now knew. She paused and then said she hoped I understood why she had to ask. Was I perhaps a caretaker or managing the property on behalf of the owner? I asked which owner she meant. She said the owner of record. I told her once more that I was the owner of record. She looked past me at my pickup truck sitting in the driveway and observed that properties in Cedar Hollow were, she searched for the phrasing, not inexpensive. I told her I was aware of that. I had just purchased one. Over the 2 weeks that followed, a series of HOA violation notices arrived in my mailbox. My truck was cited as a commercial-looking vehicle that violated the community's aesthetic standards. I checked the written HOA guidelines. My personal pickup met every written criterion with room to spare. Then a notice arrived about garbage bins being visible from the road on a non-collection day. Then one about the lawn being a fraction above the specified height. Then one citing my storage outbuilding as requiring architectural approval before any work could proceed. Then one about the light fixture above my entrance being inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Each one arrived within days of my moving in. None of them referenced a specific section of the HOA's governing documents that applied to my particular parcel. I noted that carefully. I kept every envelope, every date stamp, every email in a folder on my kitchen shelf. I did not respond with anger. I responded with documentation. I called Lydia and walked her through everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, which I had always appreciated about her, and when I finished, she didn't offer outrage or sympathy. She told me not to pay any of those fines, not yet, not one of them. Then she was quiet for a moment before she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Darius, did you actually read through Exhibit C in the closing binder? I told her I had skimmed it. She said, go back tonight and read it carefully. She didn't explain further. She just said, call me after. I found the binder, poured a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table. On the third page of Exhibit C, in plain language that required no legal training to interpret, was a single line I read 3 times. Parcel excluded from Cedar Hollow Association jurisdiction. I sat with that sentence for a long time before I called Lydia back. She had already pulled her own copy of the file while we spoke, and she walked me through the history of the parcel which she had pieced together from county records. Grant Holloway had owned the land for decades, long before Cedar Hollow Estates was developed and long before its HOA was ever formed. When the neighborhood expanded and the association was established, property owners in the surrounding area had the option to join voluntarily through a formal annexation agreement. Most of them signed. Grant Holloway never did. He had gotten along perfectly well with his neighbors, he had no formal disputes, and the HOA had simply operated around his parcel for years without ever formally incorporating it. When the development eventually spread and his land ended up geographically surrounded by Cedar Hollow, his parcel was still, as a matter of recorded law, entirely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. No covenant attached to the deed, no signed annexation agreement in the county file, no lien authority, no membership that could be transferred to a new buyer. Lydia confirmed what I had already concluded. Marla Whitcomb had no legal authority to issue violations against my property, no authority to demand vehicle registrations or occupant approvals, and no authority to levy fines. The HOA's legal boundary for every purpose that mattered stopped where my parcel began. I called the county recorder's office to verify independently, and the clerk pulled the records and confirmed the same. The parcel appeared within the general geographic outline of Cedar Hollow on a map, but it had never been annexed into the association. Grant's signature was simply never on the document. This was not a technicality or a processing error. It was a factual matter that any competent title search would have caught immediately. I could have called Lydia that afternoon and had a cease and desist letter sent to Marla before sundown. That was an option, and Lydia told me so plainly. But I decided to give the HOA the opportunity to correct itself before I made this a legal matter. Maybe Marla hadn't checked the records. Maybe the association had been operating on outdated assumptions for years without anyone stopping to verify them. I drafted an email that was as plain and as polite as I could make it. I included my parcel number, the deed recording number from the county, and a brief explanation that the property had never been annexed into Cedar Hollow's jurisdiction. I asked the HOA to confirm receipt and to withdraw the pending violations. I sent it that evening and kept a copy. Marla replied in under an hour. Her entire response was 4 words followed by a period. Our records indicate otherwise. I replied asking her to share those records with me. She did not respond. 3 days after that, the outstanding fine amounts doubled, and the day after that, I came home to find a small metal sign staked just inside my property line near the entrance of my driveway reading, "Oh Compliance." I photographed the sign, photographed the GPS coordinates on my phone screen, photographed the nearest survey marker visible in the frame. Then I removed the sign from my land and placed it neatly on the public right-of-way at the edge of the road. Marla called me that evening, and for the first time in all of this, her voice carried no trace of the managed warmth she had been performing. She said I couldn't just decide which HOA rules applied to me and which didn't. I told her that was exactly the point I had been making to her. No HOA rules applied to my property. She said the association had historic authority over the entire Cedar Hollow area. I told her that concept did not exist in law without either a recorded covenant or a signed annexation agreement, and I asked which of those she had. She didn't answer. A week later, she sent an email with a line that caught my attention more than anything she had said before. If you continue to refuse compliance, the HOA will consider exercising access rights to the property. I read that sentence very carefully. Because I had recently discovered something that Marla, it turned out, had not thought through at all. There was a stone path along the eastern edge of my land. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, and it ran along the tree line from the road toward the back of the property, following roughly the same line as my boundary with the pond. Residents used it to walk around the water. The HOA's landscaping crew used it to move equipment. Maintenance workers used it regularly to reach a small irrigation pump station that sat on a concrete pad at the far back corner, just where the pond met a utility corridor. When I first toured the property, I had assumed this was a designated easement, a formal recorded right-of-way giving the HOA legal access across my land to service that pump station. It seemed like the kind of thing that would be properly documented. I asked Lydia to check. She pulled the deed, the title commitment, and the county's easement records for my parcel number. There was no recorded easement. There was no right-of-way agreement attached to the property in any form. What she found instead, through a conversation with Grant Holloway's former attorney, was that Grant had allowed the HOA to use the path by verbal agreement, a simple neighborly arrangement that had never been formalized, never been recorded, and never been attached to any deed. As a legal matter, it did not exist. The HOA had been crossing my property every single week to service a pump station, and they had no documented right to do so. I want to be clear about what I did with that information, because the obvious move would have been to put up a fence and let Marla figure out how to reach her pump station without me. I didn't do that. I am not interested in making a point through disruption when a cleaner path is available. Instead, I sent Marla a letter through Lydia's office, requesting 2 things: that the HOA stop issuing violations against my property, and that we schedule a time, both parties represented by counsel, to discuss the path situation properly and get it formalized. I was offering her a reasonable exit from a situation that was becoming unreasonable fast. She did not take it. At the next HOA board meeting, she told the assembled members that I was attempting to use access leverage to avoid complying with community standards. I found out about this from a neighbor who forwarded me a copy of the meeting minutes. Howard Vance, a longtime board member, 61 years old, someone who had been part of Cedar Hollow since the early days, had raised a direct question during that meeting. Had anyone actually verified that my property fell within the HOA's jurisdiction? Marla had cut him off and moved the agenda forward. Denise Calder, the secretary, had said nothing. I filed the minutes in my folder alongside everything else. Marla grew bolder. One morning while I was working near the storage building, an HOA landscaping crew arrived at my driveway and began moving toward the back of the property. I walked down and told them they did not have permission to enter. They called Marla. She was there within 15 minutes, and when she stepped out of her car, the last traces of managed politeness were gone. She said I didn't own everything I could see. I told her I only claimed to own what was on the deed. She said she would need more than my word for what the deed said. I invited her inside to look at the survey with me. She declined, and she said something I have not forgotten. "I don't need a piece of paper you printed yourself." That sentence told me exactly what was happening. She wasn't looking for accuracy. She was looking for submission, and I was not going to provide it. I asked the landscaping crew to leave my property, which they did. I went back to what I had been working on. 2 mornings later, I came home from a hardware run and found a chain stretched across my secondary driveway, a short access lane on the eastern side of the property that I used to move materials between the road and the storage building. Attached to the chain was a sign, "Access restricted by Cedar Hollow HOA." I documented everything before I touched anything. I photographed the chain from multiple angles. I photographed the sign. I photographed the survey marker visible in the background of the frame, which clearly placed the entire secondary driveway within my property boundary. I recorded a short video on my phone walking the length of the chain and noting its position relative to the road and the fence line. Then I called Marla and told her that she had placed a physical barrier on my private property without any legal authority to do so, and I asked her to remove it. She told me the HOA had secured a disputed access point. I told her there was no dispute. The county survey was unambiguous about where my property ended and the road right-of-way began. She said I wasn't the one who got to make that determination. I said, "Neither are you." Over the days that followed, Marla's account of events shifted in ways I found both predictable and dangerous. She began telling neighbors, and apparently putting it into an HOA email, that I was attempting to claim common property as my own, that I had been aggressive and uncooperative, and that I was pursuing a deliberate strategy of confrontation to destabilize the neighborhood. None of that was accurate, but accuracy had stopped being the point some time ago. She was building a narrative, and I was aware of what that narrative was designed to accomplish. Then, during one of our final face-to-face encounters near my front gate, she said something that I want to record clarified the frame she had been operating in since the very first day. She said, "I have lived in this neighborhood for 17 years. People come here thinking they can change how things work." I asked her which people she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't make this a race issue." I had not used that word. I had not brought it up at any point in any conversation. She was the one who heard the accusation in her own words and rushed to deflect it. That told me exactly what category she had been sorting me into from the beginning. Since the first time she asked whether I was working for someone else. Since the first time she looked at my truck and decided what I must be. I instructed Lydia to prepare a formal certified letter and send it to the HOA on my behalf. The letter contained 5 specific demands. First, written withdrawal of every violation notice issued against my property. Second, written confirmation on HOA letterhead that my parcel was not subject to their jurisdiction. Third, immediate cessation of all use of my property, including the stone path in the secondary driveway, without a formal recorded easement agreement. Fourth, copies of all meeting minutes and internal correspondence in which my property or my residency had been discussed. Fifth, correction of any internal HOA record listing me as an unauthorized occupant. Lydia sent the letter certified mail with return receipt. The delivery confirmation is dated in my file. Marla did not respond through counsel. She did not send a legal counteroffer. She called the county sheriff's office. She reported a trespassing complaint involving a property under HOA access dispute, described the individual as confrontational, suggested the ownership was in question, and gave them my address. On a Saturday morning 2 weeks after that certified letter was delivered and signed for, I was outside working, changing the lock hardware on the storage building, when I heard vehicles turning into my lane. I looked up. 3 SUVs were pulling in. One was Marla's silver sedan. The other 2 carried county markings and the badge of the sheriff's office. They stepped out with the careful, measured movements of people trained to read situations quickly. The taller one introduced himself first. Deputy Nolan Briggs, county sheriff, badge clipped to his vest. His partner was Deputy Elise Warren, younger, quieter, carrying a tablet. Briggs did the talking. He was professional in a way I genuinely respected. The same tone, whether he was managing a parking violation or a felony, no drama, no assumptions, performed out loud. He told me they had received a call about a possible trespassing complaint and a dispute over property access. He asked if I was the person currently at the property. I said yes. He asked whether I lived there. I said yes. He went through the standard questions. Tenant, property manager, house sitter. I said no to each one. He asked my name. I told him, Darius Cole. Marla had positioned herself just behind Briggs and slightly to his left, dressed as though she had been prepared for this specific moment. She cut in before he could continue. She told him she had been trying to resolve an unauthorized occupancy situation for weeks, that I had been presenting myself as the owner while refusing to cooperate with the association, and that whoever actually owned this property had certainly not authorized my presence here. Briggs kept his attention on me. He asked a follow-up. How long had I been at this address? I told him 3 months. He asked for documentation. I said I had my driver's license and more if needed. He nodded, and then Marla said it. She had been circling it for weeks, getting close with every, but do you really own it? And every people like that don't usually. And on that Saturday morning, in front of 2 sworn county deputies, she let it out plainly. She looked at Briggs and said, look at him. You're telling me this black man bought the Holloway property? Then she turned and looked directly at me. You're a black man, not the owner. Moved for a few seconds. Briggs looked at her. Warren looked at her. I looked at her. I am not going to pretend that sentence didn't land where it was aimed. I felt it. But I also knew exactly what the next 2 minutes were going to decide, and I was not going to spend them on anger. I reached into my pocket and took out my wallet. I handed Briggs my driver's license. He looked at it and handed it back. Then I said, Deputy, I can give you the parcel number for this property. I would ask that you check the county assessor database before we go any further. Marla made a short, dismissive sound. She said anyone could look up numbers from a real estate website. I looked at Briggs and waited. He glanced at Warren, then back at me and asked for the parcel number. I gave it to him from memory, along with the deed recording date and the full legal description. He wrote it all down in his notebook. Then he walked back to his vehicle, where a laptop was mounted to the dash, and he started typing. Marla filled the silence while he was at the car. She said she had managed this neighborhood for 17 years without a single problem. She said I had arrived and immediately started making claims that didn't hold up. She had the HOA maps, she said, and the subdivision plat, and the records were clear. Deputy Warren had not spoken yet. She was watching Marla the way someone watches a thing that is about to go wrong and isn't sure exactly when the moment will arrive. I said nothing. I stood still and let Marla talk. Briggs came back from the vehicle. His expression hadn't changed in any dramatic way. He wasn't shocked, wasn't smirking, but there was a quality to it, the quiet stillness of a professional who has just confirmed something important. He looked at Marla. He said, Ma'am, the county assessors list the owner of this parcel as Darius E. Cole. Recording date matches exactly what he told me. Marla said immediately that the assessor database wasn't the final word on HOA membership rights. Briggs listened to her for a moment. Then he asked a single question, quietly and without particular emphasis. Ma'am, are you sure you want to continue with this complaint? Marla was sure. She reached into the leather portfolio she was carrying and produced a folder of HOA documents, the association's plat map, a copy of the Cedar Hollow covenants, and a printed spreadsheet of current membership records. She pointed to the plat map where my property appeared geographically inside the outer boundary line of Cedar Hollow Estates. She told Briggs that regardless of what the assessor showed for an owner's name, the property was governed territory and the association had clear authority over it. Briggs looked at the map. He handed it to Warren. Then he asked a question that seemed simple but wasn't. Is there a deed restriction recorded on this specific parcel? Marla said the covenant covered the entire neighborhood. He asked again, was there a restriction recorded on the actual deed for this property? She said the subdivision plat defined the HOA's authority over the whole area. He handed the map back to her without comment and looked at Warren. Warren was already in the county recorder's database on her tablet, working through the parcel number, the deed history, and the title chain. She pulled the legal description, the plat reference, and the annexation records for the surrounding parcels. She was thorough. She didn't rush. Then she found what I already knew was in there. Warren turned the tablet toward Briggs and pointed to a line on the screen. He read it, then he looked at me. I said nothing. He looked at the document for a few more seconds and then he said plainly, Mr. Cole, this parcel shows no deed restriction and no recorded annexation agreement with Cedar Hollow HOA. The document in the county file labeled Exhibit C specifically excludes this parcel from association jurisdiction. He said it the way facts are best delivered, without theater, without apology. Marla said that was impossible. Warren turned the tablet around and showed it to her directly. Marla looked at the screen, her mouth tightened, she started pivoting. This was clearly a clerical issue. The annexation had probably been handled informally. Grant Holloway had always participated in neighborhood activities, and it had always been understood that his property was part of Cedar Hollow. Briggs asked if that informal understanding was recorded anywhere. She said she would need to check. He asked whether the HOA had conducted any title search before issuing violations against my property. She didn't answer. Briggs asked me if I could show them where the chain barrier had been placed. I took out my phone and showed him the photographs, then walked them to the secondary driveway and pointed out the survey markers on both sides of it. The chain was still there. Then I mentioned the path. I said, while you're checking records, the stone path along the east side of the property, the one HOA maintenance uses to access the pump station at the back of the pond. There's no recorded easement for that route across my land, and I'd ask you to verify that. Warren ran the search. There was no recorded easement. Marla said the path had always been there, that it was a historic right-of-way, that Grant had agreed to it verbally for years. Briggs said a verbal arrangement was not the same as a recorded easement, and that legally the distinction mattered very much. He then summarized what the records showed in straightforward terms. I was the documented owner of the property. Parcel was not under HOA jurisdiction. The chain had been placed on private land without legal authority and needed to be removed. The path use was a civil matter, but the current record did not support the HOA's access claim. No criminal trespass had occurred at this address, not by me. Then he looked at Marla and asked if she had anything else to add. She was quiet. I had been waiting for a moment where the facts sat in front of people who had no stake in the outcome and no reason to favor either side. I looked at Marla. She was staring at Warren's tablet like it had personally offended her. I said, "You were right about one thing, Marla." She looked up. I said, "I'm not the kind of owner you were imagining." Briggs asked me one more question before anyone else could respond. He said, "Mr. Cole, would you like us to document the unauthorized obstruction on your property?" Marla spoke immediately. She said, "Darius, I think we can work this out like neighbors." The shift in her tone was so complete and so rapid that it would have been almost impressive if it had not been so predictable. An hour earlier I had been a black man who couldn't conceivably own this property. Now I was Darius and a neighbor and someone she felt confident we could come to a reasonable understanding with. I have seen this transformation before in various forms and settings, the exact moment when someone realizes that the machinery they set in motion is turning back toward them, and the vocabulary immediately switches from enforcement to reconciliation. I am not saying this to be uncharitable. I am saying it because what was actually happening deserves to be named clearly. Marla was not having a change of heart. She was reassessing risk. I told Briggs, yes, I would like the incident documented. He and Warren prepared a report covering the dispatch call, the confirmed ownership, the unauthorized obstruction, and the dispute regarding HOA jurisdiction and property access. I received a copy before they left. Warren was nearby during the process and said very little. The chain came down that same afternoon. The sign was removed. I didn't celebrate. I had work left to finish on the storage building, and I went back to it. Lydia called me the next morning and told me this wasn't finished. The violations were still formally on record with the association, and formal HOA violations, even ones issued without authority, can create complications in future title searches if they're never officially withdrawn. She said if I ever intended to refinance, sell, or transfer the property, those records needed to be cleaned up by the HOA, not simply left sitting in their files. So I prepared a formal written demand with 5 specific items: written withdrawal of every violation notice, written confirmation that my parcel was outside HOA jurisdiction, cessation of all access to my property without a formal recorded easement, copies of all internal communications in which my residency had been discussed, and correction of any record designating me as an unauthorized occupant. Lydia sent it certified mail. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting within the week. This was not, I would learn, a meeting that went well for Marla. Howard Vance came in with questions, and they were not gentle ones. He asked why violations had been issued against a property that wasn't under the OA's jurisdiction. He asked why a physical barrier had been placed on private land. He asked who had authorized the call to the sheriff's office. Marla said everything had been done in good faith, that the records were ambiguous, that the situation had escalated in ways she hadn't anticipated. Denise Calder, the O secretary, had been quiet through most of the preceding weeks. She was not quiet at this meeting. She brought a folder. Inside the folder was a printed email chain. One email in particular had been written by Marla several weeks before any deputies were called, before any chain had been placed on any driveway, before the very first violation notice had been mailed. It had been written the same week I moved in. The substance of it, reported as accurately as I can. She doubted I had actually purchased the property, and that people like me typically worked for owners like Grant Holloway rather than being owners themselves. The room went quiet. Howard Vance put down his pen. Two other board members looked at each other. Marla looked at the printed email the way someone looks at a thing they cannot disclaim but are desperately trying to find an angle on. She couldn't find one. Denise confirmed that she had flagged the ownership question twice in writing before any violation was ever issued, and that both times her messages had been set aside. She produced those emails. She produced the meeting minutes showing Howard's question about jurisdiction being cut off. She produced the certified letter receipt and the log showing it had been signed for. The picture that assembled itself in that room was not of an HOA making an innocent procedural error. It was of a person who had been given accurate information, chosen to disregard it repeatedly, and continued escalating because she had not been able to accept that the information was correct. I attended the meeting and sat toward the back. I had made my requests in writing and through counsel, and I didn't need to narrate my own case when the documents were already doing it. Howard Vance called for votes. The board voted to suspend Marla from her enforcement authority pending an internal review. They voted to issue a formal written resolution confirming that my parcel was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. They voted to begin the process of withdrawing all issued violations. At the close of the meeting, Howard turned to me directly and apologized on behalf of the association. He was a deliberate, measured man, and his apology was sincere. I told him I appreciated it. I said, I didn't move into Cedar Hollow looking for a conflict. I don't need anyone to like me. I just need people to stop making claims on things that belong to me. He nodded. He understood. The one remaining practical issue was the path. The HOA still needed access to the pump station. Without it, the irrigation system servicing the east side of the neighborhood would suffer, and that wasn't a problem I wanted to create for people who had nothing to do with what Marla had done. I asked Lydia to draft a limited easement agreement. The HOA could use the stone path for maintenance access during specified hours, for that purpose only. Any damage to my land caused by that use would be repaired at the association's expense. The easement applied only to the narrow path and created no additional rights over any other part of my property. The board signed it within the week. The woman who had told 2 county deputies that I couldn't possibly be the owner of this land now needed my signature on a document in order to be permitted to walk across it. A few weeks after the board meeting, I was out near the front of the property repairing a section of fence. It was a quiet morning, good light, no wind, the kind of day where the work goes cleanly and your mind can stay close to the task. I was in the middle of setting a post when Marla's silver sedan came down Ashford Lane. She was no longer HOA president. She still lived in the neighborhood, and I had no particular desire to extend any hostility beyond where it had already been carried. She slowed as she passed my driveway. She didn't stop. She looked toward me for a moment, and I could see her foot ease off the accelerator, the pause of someone who briefly considers saying something and then decides against it. Then she drove on. I don't need an apology from Marla Whitcomb. I'm not saying that to sound noble. I'm saying it because an apology from her at this point would be an apology for the performance, for how things ended up, and not for the conviction that drove every decision she made from the first morning she pulled into my driveway. What she believed when she saw me working on my own land, what she chose to act on without ever bothering to verify, what she said in front of 2 deputies, those things did not come from confusion. They came from certainty. The incident report and the board resolution changed her circumstances. They did not change her assumptions. What I have instead is the record. The deed recording number at the county courthouse, Exhibit C. I should have read more carefully from the start. The incident report from Deputies Briggs and Warren. The signed easement agreement, which is also on file at the county now. The board resolution. The email from Denise's folder. All of it documented, none of it arguable, every page exactly where it is supposed to be. When Marla built her case on what she assumed I must be, she built it while standing directly in front of what I actually was. The owner of record. The name on every relevant document, the person whose parcel number returned the same result from every database she could have checked at any point if she had ever bothered to look. I did not buy that property to make a statement about what a black man can own. I bought it because I liked the land and the quiet and the trees along the eastern edge and the long list of things that needed to be fixed on the outbuilding. But Marla needed a lesson, and I didn't have to be the one to teach it. The county records did that for me. A deed doesn't care what you look like, what you drive, or where other people have decided someone like you belongs. It records exactly one thing: who holds title. And on every document in that file, on every line that mattered, on every record at the courthouse, that name was mine.